Welcome, everyone. Hope you all are doing well and are avoiding slipping and sliding. It's not so bad out there today, but it was definitely bad out there yesterday. Although it makes for an interesting contrast. When I was coming in this morning, the trees are all covered in ice and they were melting, and it made a sound I've never heard before. It was like a mixture between cracking and melting. I'm not sure what that is, but my observations on life could continue this entire class period, but I guess we better talk about forensics, shouldn't we? Real quick, before we get started, I've got some good news. I promised that I would try to get this updated, and I did. It was literally like 5 minutes before class that I got this uploaded. It is on Brightspace. I have not created the actual assignment yet, but I will do so later today. It's the details of the fraud scheme project. Now, there's a lot of things that I want to go through here, so I figure that we can spend some time talking about this real quick. So it's a 100-point assignment. There are 4 deliverables. I think I told you three beforehand, and I decided I wanted to do a 4th one. Just because I wanted to have an update assignment. You can see the update assignment part is really, really brief. It's 5 points. It's going to be due at the end of week 7. This is just for you to share your idea about what you want to do for your fraud scheme. It's not intended to be onerous. It's going to be around 1 page. Okay, that's what that means, around 1 page and like that. The idea behind this is that if you've got an idea and you're kind of trying to finalize it or look for some expansion, I can read through it and I can say, all right, this is good. Have you considered this possibility? Or if you're pretty set on it and I see something that's a fatal flaw, I can say you might want to consider this as a problem. For the most part, I don't anticipate that. You all are very, very smart. And my expectation is you will think about this in thorough detail and come up with these ideas. But I would like you to kind of think about these 4 prompts. This is going to be what's going to frame your fraud scheme: who committed the fraud, how the fraud was committed, the economic impact, and the financial benefit the suspects received. So you should outline that. You do not need to have firm details in your first deliverable, but you should at least have some idea of how you're going to set that up in the case. Second deliverable, this is due at the end of week 10, so you do have a couple weeks after the beginning of the semester, or sorry, the semester, a few weeks after spring break to work on this. So basically, this is going to be your fraud scheme itself, and you will have to have this prepared and ready for investigation by the end of week 10. There are not going to be any late assignments accepted on this. If you have a late submission on this, you will receive 0 for the entire deliverable. That's 100 points. Okay. I want to make that very, very clear because the timing on this is really, really important. I know that's a very harsh criticism to say, but keep in mind here that I'm giving you 10 weeks to complete this. And I've probably been telling you, pretty diligent about telling you to start thinking about this now. I know that there's a complaint in that we're only getting the instructions into week 4, but that's still another 7 weeks if you think about spring break to think about this. So please do not challenge me on this and say I'm not sure I can finish this in a timely manner. The one thing I'm going to ask for you, a timely delivery for this course, is this particular item, because I cannot move forward if somebody says, can I have it in a week? That actually cuts a week off the investigation, which is more than I'm willing to accept. So again, be very, very clear. If there's a late submission on this, you're not going to be doing the rest of the activity. So please do not challenge me on that one. So basically, deliverable fraud case itself. You should basically have 2 parts to this. You're going to have one part that's going to be the case that you're going to deliver to your investigator. This will not be the complete fraud case. They should not be able to read through the fraud case and say, oh, I know exactly what the fraud is and what the scope and the scheme of the fraud. That should not be the case. They should be able to have to conduct an investigation and ask you for more details and more information. So that's what the second part of the fraud is. The second part of the case is you're going to deliver to me what additional information you're going to provide to the investigator, provided they ask the right question, of course. You can't just say, all right, here's the fraud case, and here's all the additional information I have. Go nuts, all right? Your investigator is going to have to actually work on this one. That's the goal here. So yeah, I realize that this is a big ask and you've never done something like this before. So does everybody remember the Tallahassee bean counters case that we did at the very first week of class? I have uploaded that case to Brightspace, as well as the teaching notes for that case. And the teaching notes direct how somebody who's conducting the case would actually go through the investigation. I want to be very, very clear about this. I do not expect anybody in this room to prepare a case on the scope or scale of the Tallahassee bean counters. It's like a 40-page case with like 20, 30 page of teaching notes. I don't expect you to go that crazy with this, all right? But I do think that that's a really good guideline for you to use. Max, I think you should think about doing 1, maybe 2 fraud schemes if you really want to get creative. In the Tallahassee bean counters case, there were 3 fraud schemes, and they were very, very detailed fraud schemes. I'm not asking for that level of detail. I'm not asking for that level of thoroughness. I'm asking for a microcosm of that. That's still going to be plenty of work. Trust me when I say that. It's plenty of work to do 1 fraud and do it well. but I think this could be a very good guide for how you can frame that fraud. And again, if you have any questions on this, you're free to add them to me. You'll hear me say this again. This is one of those things. Please don't wait until right after spring break and say, oh yeah, I've got that deliverable. Start thinking about that now. Start brainstorming. I don't expect that our cases moving forward will take the entire Tuesday class sessions. So this is a good opportunity for you to start thinking about them and asking questions, start roughing those out. All right. If you're taking time off early from class, I mean, I'm going to assume that you're already started thinking about the case and have got a good idea about your working at it. But yeah, please make sure you're very diligent about that. All right, here's the fun part. Once week 10 hits, basically what we're going to do is I'm going to take week 1, your case, and I'm going to give it to somebody else in the class, and they're going to be the investigator. You in turn will actually get a case to investigate. So the next 4 weeks, weeks 11, 12, 13, and 14, there's going to be investigations going on, and they're going to have 2 responsibilities. First of all, you're going to have the responsibility for being responsive to whoever's investigating your case. So somebody's going to be trying to figure out what's going on with your fraud, and you're going to have to be detailed in that response or that respect. Plus, you're going to be an investigator in somebody else's fraud. So there's a few things that are going to be noteworthy here. First of all, there will be a small deliverable. It'll be a 1 to 2 page deliverable that will, or 2 to 3 page deliverable that will show your investigation findings. You remember these, and these are going to come up again. This is what you should have at a minimum in your investigation. Who committed the fraud, how the fraud was committed, the economic impact, and the financial benefits the suspects received from committing the crime. By the way, if that's going to look very familiar because we're going to have another case that's going to have those exact parameters word for word, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. You can include additional information you think is relevant, but this is the minimum that you need to have in your investigation. Now, to ensure that the investigation and the cases go smoothly, I am going to do something else. Or when I say I do that, Matt's going to set it up for me. So if you really want to, get an advantage on this, if you want to commit fraud in this fraud case, you can bribe him because he'll have access to all of this. But we're going to set up Google Docs for everybody in the class, or each case investigator pair. And the investigator will document everything that takes place over the course of the investigation in the Google Doc. Okay. So basically what will happen is we'll have a Google document, and all communication over the course of the investigation should be recorded. You will notice that there's some stars here. There's a bit disclaimer. That does not mean that you have to run your inquiries through that Google document. You're welcome to do so if you talk to your case author and say, I'm going to send you questions over the Google Doc, and can you respond over the Google Doc? If you make that arrangement, that's perfectly fine. If you want to email, that's fine too. If you want to interview, if you want to have phone calls, if you want to text, I don't care what form the investigation takes, but everything should be summarized within this Google document. Part of the reason for this is if say Brock is investigating Kyle, Brock sends a question at the beginning of week 11 and Kyle doesn't respond until the beginning of week 14. I want to know what the timeline for that is. Okay. So I can actually, for once, take some points away from one of Kyle's assignments. Okay, that's one of the goals there. All right, no, I'm joking. I use an object lesson, but yeah, if that's the case, I want to make sure that I understand what's going on with the investigation and what's going on with the case author. And I'm going to be monitoring that throughout the entire time. So please make sure that you're diligent about that. I've got some points on that. I'm going to have your grade based on multiple factors. You're going to have completion of the grade required for the write-up, evidence of effort and diligence in your investigation. That as evidenced by the information collected in the Google document. Not only just did you collect enough information, but were you timely in collecting it in a consistent manner? And then cooperation and correspondence with the investigation in your case as the case author. Okay, so that you provided information as necessary. Then final week, we're going to have our investigation breakdown. This will be a little bit more fun than the one students who are online are doing that. They're just going to record a brief investigation summary of what the results are. Same thing that we did in advanced AAS. It's one slide. You're going to summarize the results of investigation on a single slide. The fun part will be is that after the 3 minutes, we're going to talk to the case author and say, did they find everything? And they're going to say yes or no, or they missed something or something like that. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens, what the results of the investigation are versus what the case author thinks. Some notes on this. Obviously, I've already said this already, but think about this now. Do not start thinking about this 3-4 weeks from now. Start thinking about cases. I know some people have already started thinking about it. Had some interesting ideas and have shared them with me. I'm really encouraged about those, but I do want to make sure everybody's moving at the same pace. I do encourage you to be creative as possible on this. Okay. Please keep in mind as you're creating your cases, the ultimate goal is to actually have an investigator be able to solve the case. All right. And when I say solve the case through a diligent amount of work, I don't want this to be so simple that it would take like 1 or 2 days of work and then it's done. It's like ask 3 or 4 questions and it's like, oh, okay, that was easy. That's not a sufficient case. Similarly, if you put something together like the Tallahassee bean counters case that is so nuanced and so detailed that it will require a group effort of multiple weeks to finish, then that's probably too much. Okay. Have some fun with this, be creative with it, but make sure you know where to draw the line and do what is necessary with the investigation. This is probably the most important point with the notes here. Please make sure you have a plan in place for communication with your case authors and your investigators. This needs to be consistent. Again, the worst thing that can happen is if people are waiting long periods of time or trying to throw a lot of information in one period of time. I would like this to be a consistent routine over that 4-week period. I know you're MAC students. I know that I'm assigning this right after graduate comps are going to be taking place, and you're going to have other stuff going on in your lives. I realize that I'm asking a lot, but I would encourage you to try to think about doing this one thing per day. This is one thing Alan Davis used to say. So do one thing per day in every class, and you're never far behind. I would encourage for this particular assignment that you think about, okay, what can I do today to advance my investigation, or what can I do to respond effectively to the investigation? Be consistent about that. And if for some reason you finish the case within 2 weeks and have all the information you need, great, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. But if you're finding that your pace is not going quickly enough, then you can advance the pace and move forward. If you get to that final week and have not done anything and try to finish the investigation in a full week, that may be cause for alarm, okay? And that was something that will affect your grade. I will make a note, if I discover you're not responding to your investigator in a timely manner, or you waited in the investigation deadline to conduct your case off another, I will reduce your deliverable grade in that area by a substantial amount. Keep in mind that out of the 100 points, that section is worth 50 points. So that's half the grade associated with this. And 50 points is enough to drop you by a letter grade in this particular course. Actually, a little bit more than a letter grade. Last thing, this is my obvious disclaimer for everything. Be prepared to ask a lot of questions, not just the case in the investigation. Be prepared to ask me a lot of questions. I don't expect you to be an expert in this. In fact, we're going to be learning all as this goes together. This is a project that I've never put together, and I don't know what the scope and scale of this is going to be. I expect it's pretty substantial. I think it will be cool. I think people will have a lot of fun with it, but I think that there's going to be a lot of nuance to it that I'm not expecting. And so if you're not asking me questions, then I'm going to be assuming that you have everything figured out. And I know that's going to be a hazardous assumption, but I'm going to be ready to answer questions as need be. So you need to prepare to ask questions as need be. Any questions on this? All right. Like I said, start thinking about this now. Start thinking about how to do it. I will get everything posted so you have reminders. But this is going to be obviously a big project, considering that it's basically 20% of the grade. So you need to start thinking about how that's going to, what you're going to be doing associated with that. Something that is not 20% of the grade, but is very important. We're going to talk about the final section of financial transactions and fraud schemes. So specialized industry frauds, as well as some specialized technology and consumer fraud. So this is fairly isolated, the fraud examiner's manual, which I mentioned. But I think all of these were important to identify. These are definitely certain types of frauds that really kind of make me a little bit worried, a little bit concerned. You will notice that if you've taken a look at the graduate comps questions, one of these things that we barely talk about in here, I actually ask a pretty detailed question on. We start talking about elder fraud. That's actually an area of fraud that I'm personally interested in, simply because of the nature of fraud and what our responsibilities are as accountants in that area. So something that even though we may not go to it in detail in the questions, I may expect you to have a lot more understanding of it from a big picture perspective at the very least. So let's go ahead and just talk about the individual questions, and then we'll get into the details of the other questions. And so let's see. Let's start out with group. I'll start with group one. Are you ready to do start with group one, Megan, or should I start with group 6? All right. That is the positive answer I want to hear right there. All right. So can you define insurance fraud for me, please?
We said it was a crime that involves intentionally deceiving insurance companies to create any financial.
Yeah. It's hard to believe that that people would try to take advantage of insurance companies. Insurance companies are just so reasonable and decent. I'm obviously being facetious, but yeah, anything that kind of tries to take away a legal acts that try to take illicit advantage of insurance policy provisions and payouts. Some interesting things about insurance fraud. Why are the insurance so susceptible to fraud? So Megan, I'm gonna stick with you on this one.
There's very few controls over the insurance claim, and they have like a very high inflow of cash usually, so it's very attractive.
So what do we know about cash already in this course? Is this a very attractive target for fraud? we've specifically talked about it for misappropriation of assets, but if you've got a company that has high levels of cash, does that make them an attractive target for fraud? Saying, yeah, we know that you can give us a payout because you've got those resources. So obviously that's going to be relevant for that organization. Now, something that's a little bit more nuanced that wasn't really discussed in the fraud examiner's manual, but it's kind of interesting to discuss. Are insurance companies, do they just kind of exist in a vacuum? Do they take your insurance money and just kind of hold on to it and just like put it under a mattress? No, they're trying to generate returns on investment with that. They're basically like large investment companies that have to eventually pay out, but in the form of insurance claims. So do they have pressures associated with their own operations? Yeah, they have to generate high returns on investment in order for it to be profitable, okay? Does that kind of lead to potential fraud and abuse concerns that we have? So what do we call a return on investment requirement for a manager? What would that be characterized? What fraud risk factor? That'd be a pressure. Okay, so we know that a pressure exists. So all we have to have is an opportunity and a rationalization, somebody who can rationalize. And it's hard to believe that insurance companies could rationalize bad behavior. Man, I'm really bashing on insurance companies today. I'm telling you, I don't know where this negativity came from. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to be a more positive person moving forward. Just hard to do when you're teaching about fraud. Anyway, yeah. So pressure. We have the rationalization. All that really needs necessary is the opportunity. So yeah, some concerns there. So question number 2, what might incentivize a healthcare patient to commit fraud? So my group 2 leader is Matt Foster. Matt, what do you know about fraud for healthcare?
Well, so you can make a lot of money off of it if you're like submitting claims for things you don't have, or maybe you would be eligible for something except for like 1 or 2 minor details, even those out so you can get covered for something. You might be able to get drugs that you can resell. If that's
Okay. Could you get drugs for not resale?
Again, yeah, that's
I mean, there's that concern as well. So yeah, there's actually a lot of attractive targets with healthcare patients. At a remedial level, we may just say it just may be so they can get necessary care and provisions and they don't have the resources to do that. But there may be more devious motives in place. We could, as Matt pointed out, when we talk about healthcare, that's actually the one area where illicitly controlled substances are prescribed out for people who need them. And that's going to be the intention. But if you have somebody who's committing fraud, they could acquire these illicitly controlled substances and use them for whatever purposes. We'd like to think that if they're doing that, that they're probably selling it for a monetary benefit. There's certainly the problem that we could have people who are using those and abusing those drugs for their own purposes. Either way, we're going to consider that fraud, and that's something that's not an intended use of that particular asset. So we can consider that a very, very obvious route to a misappropriation of assets in that regard. So certainly problematic when we talk about healthcare fraud, which is related to insurance fraud, but we're going to talk about the nature of that here in just a second. Okay, get into a little bit more detail. All right. Question number 3, what are some common signs a telemarketer might be trying to scam or defraud you? Tyler, what's your opinion about it, telemarketers? What your personal opinion? What is your thoughts?
Yeah, I haven't had to put up with it yet, but
No kidding. So do you have your phone set? It was like where if you don't recognize the call, then you just automatically listen to voicemail? You don't pick up? See, I will say that that's probably a good policy. That when I learned my phone could actually block out any number I don't recognize. Now, if it's a phone, it just immediately goes to a voicemail, and I generally don't leave a voicemail. It even says press scam likely or something like that as one of the messages on there. But there are some people who still pick up the phone, especially people with landlines who don't want the phone to keep ringing. And sometimes on the other end, they've got a telemarketer. So what are some signs that a telemarketer might be trying to scam or defraud you?
That's what we said, like, we use that urgency tactic, like, accept now, and give us your personal information, stuff like that.
Right.
Things are too good.
I'm glad you used that term because I've got those exact 5 words in my description as well. So things that are too good to be true. So an interesting question is that are telemarketers necessarily always trying to hawk the goods or services that they claim to be selling in a phone call? Not necessarily. So it's important to note that telemarketing scams can actually resemble phishing schemes. And we talked about that back in Advanced AIS. When we talk about phishing, they're not necessarily contacting you because they want to provide you with reasonable goods or services. They may be trying to get your information so they can send you something that you didn't order or compromise your identity so they can use that for their own benefit. So there's some real concerns with respect on that, gathering personal information on their victims. And yeah, certainly could be used for unintentional purposes. I will to say telemarketing schemes have kind of changed the form and content. We tend to think telemarketing schemes as being over the phone schemes, but I mean, even so much, how many people actually spend time talking on their phone anymore? I mean, I would say, especially my generation has made the adaptation, and your generation is few removed from mine. Still, we call on the phone, but oftentimes when we talk about communication, it's going to be through some other electronic medium like email or text message, or even sending a TikTok to somebody to say, "What do you think of my dance moves?" But I assume that's what you kids do over TikTok. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't have TikToks, but yeah, but telemarketing still is prevalent, particularly in older generations who still use the phone fairly regularly, but they can actually take other forms when we talk about email communication or other communication. I think we can actually talk about telemarketing schemes via text message, which those are a lot harder to detect the intent of those simply because there's not a vocal quality that can be implicit. So it's hard to read intent just reading a message. So telemarketing can actually take a number of forms, and several of them can be malevolent. All right, we're just jumping around all over our topics today. What is a boot sector virus and how do you get rid of it? Boot sector virus. So Dylan, what'd your group say on boot sector viruses?
We said it was like a hard disk or a storage device that when plugged into your computer turns on, it basically affects your entire computer.
That sounds bad.
Yeah, it does sound bad.
Yeah.
It asked like how do you get rid of it,
Mhm.
and Holden and Leah said you can go in and like change the actual boot code, and you have to basically get rid of everything. I said once it hits your computer, you're done.
Yeah. So just take the flamethrower on it, do it, and move on. Yeah. So it may not be that bad. It is problematic because when you boot up, especially if you're connected to a network, it's going to infect other computers on the network. So if you're talking about a closed network, like a local area network within a job site, then it will affect computers that are on their network. That being said, most of us, when we talk about our personal computers, those are not going to be on a network. So there's a limited amount of infection space. If you know enough about technology, you could go into the code, especially if it's like on your registry, you could fix it. What is a more likely solution that we probably all should take seriously? Antivirus, yeah, antivirus. What'd you say? Call a professional, yeah. No, you can kind of call a professional to get antivirus software on there. A good antivirus program will go a long way, especially if you keep it updated consistently, because it's going to update to the new virus codes and the new malware codes that are going to be problematic. So I will say that it's really important for that for your own personal computers. That being said, if you're on a network, a local area network, and people are not updating properly, even the best laid plans can go awry simply because you can have one person who's not running their antivirus updates and their computer gets infected. And despite the fact that you did everything correct, your computer still gets infected because somebody else is not diligent, which may or may not be the reason why we had a ransomware attack 2 years ago. But we're not going to get into that now, are we? No, we're not going to talk about that. So yeah, something to concern ourselves with. All right, finally, what are the phases of the procurement process? Now, what class is this that I'm asking about the phases of the procurement process? Kirsten, so it sounds like I'm going back to AIS. So let's just go ahead and go back to AIS 367. I don't think you took 367 with me. So I'm going to be very judgmental about your solutions here, about your answers here. All right.
I said the solicitation phase, the solicitation phase, the bid evaluation and award phase, post award and then one phase.
Right. So basically, trying to probe for information about whether or not there would be a possible route to a vendor. That's pre-solicitation. Solicitation is saying we'd like to buy from you. Then they'll send a bid evaluation and the award, and the post-award administration, especially we're talking about a long-term contract, would be the actual services and goods provided. So yeah, all four of those are identified. Good. Of course, that's according to the procurement process, the fraud examiner's manual. If we go back and look at AIS, that they're completely internally different terminology. But yeah, that is the answer I was looking for, though. The question then says, which phase of this process do you feel is most susceptible to fraud and why? So what did your group identify in this particular context?
So the pre-solicitation phase. but I just thought it had most opportunities to, but.
Yeah, I think in terms of number of different fraud schemes, pre-solicitation was the most susceptible. So I think that's identification. I didn't really clarify as far as which is the most susceptible fraud and like what should be your classification of that. Is it in terms of number of different frauds, the severity of frauds, the financial and monetary implications of fraud. I think as far as the phrase where fraud is most likely to occur, my personal opinion, and this is just my opinion, is probably post-award administration, simply because there's less recourse once the contract has already been resolved, unless the contract terms have been very specifically delineated to kind of have some sort of recourse. And then most frauds in the procurement process require fraudulent actions in multiple phases. So it's really, really hard if we're talking about procurement phases for one to exist in isolation. Usually we're talking about frauds that occur across multiple phases. In fact, I think we see that for one of our examples today, one of the case examples we had to look at today. All right, question number 6. On the surface, healthcare fraud and insurance fraud sound very similar. That's a bold statement. Let's say, Lotus, does your group agree with my sentiment in that particular statement?
Yes.
Okay, so what makes them different and which one do you think is more serious?
Healthcare fraud is kind of a subset of insurance fraud where the insurance fraud is not healthcare fraud. And we said that we believe that insurance fraud is more serious.
Right. And so that's pretty consistent with my explanation. My explanation is that healthcare fraud is in many cases a subset of insurance fraud. That being said, do we think that healthcare fraud probably represents a significant component of insurance fraud? Like if we were to look at all insurance frauds that ever taken place, that would several of those or even a majority of those possibly be healthcare fraud? I don't have the quantitative details. Unfortunately, I don't have that for this particular question, but I would suspect that being the case. Healthcare fraud is one area of fraud that's very, very prone and very prevalent. It's in the news quite frequently. So it's very serious. That being said, overall, we would assume that insurance fraud is going to be more serious as a category because it comprises different areas. We could talk about property fraud, property insurance fraud. We could talk about fraud that's associated with claims and like workman's compensation, something like that. All the different areas, anything that's associated with insurance could actually be associated with fraud in that area. So it's going to be higher level. All right. Question that was on everybody's minds and something we talk about. So this is going to be the interesting classification. And I'm going to put a few people on the spot here. So how do Ponzi schemes differ from pyramid schemes? All right, Megan, back to you. What does your group say?
Said that Ponzi schemes are focused on getting investors, and like as the investors line up, you like take the most recent practice or
Mhm.
something. Kind of like a loop chain. And then pyramid schemes are when you focus on getting like recruiting people to sell products with a very large cost.
Good. All right. So Ponzi schemes, generally going to be paying off existing investors by attracting new investors. It's possible that you could kind of classify other Ponzi schemes, not necessarily as investor privilege, but they're going to have a similar buy-in concept where people are going to be paid off that exist by the presence of new investors. The lack of new investment capital is usually what causes a Ponzi scheme to fall apart. And so we can look at recent examples of that. There's one that kind of jumps to mind, but we'll get to that here in just a second. Pyramid schemes, they tend to be a little bit more transparent, and oftentimes they're not even classified as illegal, but operate on a similar principle. The prosperity of an individual tier really kind of depends on what how many participants are acquired in the following tier. So basically, think about it. The people at the top of the pyramid, they're kind of sitting on top of one other tier, and their livelihood and their basically everything that they have is based on how solid that tier right below them is. All right, that tier crumbles, they come crumbling down too because it's the top. And so then the people in the next tier, then they have their prosperity built on the people that's right below them. And so that's kind of a traditional pyramid structure. And there's obviously that office meme where they're talking about whether something's a pyramid scheme, and Jim has to draw it out for Michael and actually shows how it looks like a triangle. And Michael's like, I have to call someone. Yeah. So pyramid scheme. So I kind of asked you to do that. I will say that the concepts conceptually, they are similar. Okay. They're not necessarily the same thing. One big distinction is that organizations can have a pyramid structure, and that does not mean that they're pyramid or Ponzi schemes in nature. So we can identify something that's pyramid in nature and still be legitimate, if a little bit suspicious. So what's an example of each type of scheme? So we're going to go for one of each. Matt, what'd you identify for Ponzi scheme?
I was Bernie Madoff's whole deal.
That was my example too, the Madoff securities. So yeah, basically Madoff said, I'm going to give you 19% return on investment. Where did that 19% return come from? New investors, yeah, new investors, all people putting in no capital. And then, so then those new investors would come in and says, I want 19% too. So Madoff would actually have to attract more investors. In fact, if you ever watched, I think it's the King of Lies was the HBO documentary. When the whole thing came falling apart, he was desperately trying to attract a new investor or drag more investment. And he went to an existing investor and said, I can guarantee you a 25% return on investment if you invest now. And it was actually, I think, the CEO of Home Depot who he was talking to, and he said, I've been told that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And that was kind of the thing that fell out. It's like he kept having to promise higher and higher returns to new investors because he kind of reached a limit of new investors he could reach. So he started reaching out to existing investors, providing higher returns. And the founder basically said, yeah, or the Home Depot CEO basically said, yeah, I don't believe you. And of course, he was right. Madoff was orchestrating a giant Ponzi scheme. Tyler, what's an example of a pyramid scheme?
I didn't look, I didn't know if I was supposed to look up a scheme, so I just kind of made it up.
That's fine. That's fine. It doesn't need to be a specific existence fraud scheme.
Basically, someone, for example, I started a business and I recruit 2 people and I took rock. They want to recruit 2 more people. Basically, it's just the money tax comes up, everyone pays like a fee to come in.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Sounds very much like The Office. Yeah. We're gonna call you Michael Scott from now on. Yeah. All right. No. So very, very similar to multi-level marketing companies. Okay. And again, those are not necessarily classified as fraud schemes, but effectively that's what they are. They say, I'm going to recruit 2 people and my proceeds are going to be based on the work of those 2 people. And those 2 people, their work is going to be focused on recruiting 2 people. One of the things that the ACCT fraud examiner's manual talks about is when does it become fraudulent? And the answer was when there's more focus on the structure of the organization than there is about the nature of certain goods or services the organization provides. So anybody ever heard of Amway? So I don't know what presence they had. They were very big prior to the internet area as a multi-level marketing scheme. And basically they provide goods and services you could buy through a catalog, but the catalog was not the big issue. Like the goods you could buy in the catalog were anything that you could buy at a grocery store. That was not the issue. The issue was that if you convince people to start buying out of the Amway catalog, they become basically your subordinates. And if you get 6 subordinates that reach a certain tier of purchases, then you reach this level of prosperity. And again, the focus was on the structure and not on the goods or services that were being sold itself, which is why Amway got sued very, very heavily several years ago, saying, yeah, you're a pyramid scheme. And the rest of us were like going, duh, yeah. But there were some other examples. I will say, and this probably comes out. One of the people identified Cutco knives as a pyramid scheme, which I laughed at because one of my best friends in high school sold Cutco knives as a side job. Okay, and so I actually texted him. I said, "Yeah, we're talking about pyramid schemes in my forensics class, and they identified Cutco knives." And he protested and said, well, my knives that I had from high school still work, which was like 30 years ago, you know, so not a pyramid scheme. The products are good. Okay. But actually the products were pretty good. They were pretty solid, but the company was focused more on trying to recruit people to sell the knives. Yeah. So interesting. I do remember the discussion because he was trying to get people to demo the knife store. And he said, he doesn't get paid on selling knives. He gets paid on how many demos he conducts, which turned out to be a fat, bold-faced lie, not by him, but by the people who he was reporting to. But the knives are still pretty good. He still uses them. So yeah, yeah. So there's that. If he ever watches this video, he's going to be mad that I called him out in the middle of class. You know, he's a decent guy, a very decent individual, which I hate to admit that. Yeah. So moving on. What are the different categories of procurement fraud schemes? Provide a definition of each. So let's go ahead and go through each of these. We got some multiple categories of fraud schemes. Dylan, what's one of these?
Schemes involving collusion among contractors.
Collusion. We've heard that term before. How does this work?
It's trying to evade the bidding process by working together to beat out competition.
Yeah, so basically you've got one contractor says, I'm winning the bid, but if you all will overbid whatever I bid, I will pay you a portion of the proceeds, so we all benefit from it. Okay. Which kind of defeats the bidding process because the whole purpose of the bidding process is to get the most competitive bid. So if they're all colluding with one another, that is problematic. Now, this can be bypassed if you get one contractor that's honest, that, you know what, I'm not falling for it. I'm gonna go for an honest, legitimate bid. Then whole thing can fall apart. But for the most part, collusion is really, really hard to bypass as a fraud scheme. Remember, we talked about collusion back in auditing, and I said collusion was problematic with respect to controls. Why is that the case? It's because collusion is an inherent limitation of controls, because controls cannot address certain issues, can't address errors and mistakes, can't address management override, can't address collusion. So if we had collusion in this particular scenario, it would be very, very hard to stop, especially if it occurs externally. What's another example of a scheme in this area? Kirsten, what's your group identify?
Involving contractors and procurement employees.
Okay, what's that? Right, so contractor really wants to have a bid with the organization, so they contact somebody inside and says, if you make sure we get this bid, we'll make sure that your palms get greased. Is that still a term that you guys use, greasing the palms, you know? Yeah, I don't know, it's a weird term that's always been existing. I just, think about the implications of that I don't know that I want grease on my palms, to be honest, I'm really, really sensitive to my hands being dirty. But yeah, so basically the idea is they're bribing somebody inside the organization to get that. So it's kind of a kickback in that regard. All right, that's a good one. Lotus, did your group identify another one? Very good. So what is that? So that reminds me of the old episodes of Star Trek. Did anybody ever watch like not the new ones, not like the new recent ones, but like the older episodes of Star Trek, like with Captain Kirk and Spock and seeing those? So there was always the miracle worker Scotty, who was in the engine room, and he later admitted in like an episode of The Next Generation, he said, yeah, he inflated his estimates by twice so that he could always seem like a miracle worker. That's kind of what I thought about when I thought about this. Is like, yeah, you know that you could accomplish it for this bid, but you actually increase your prices to this amount so that you get a little bit more on the side. Yeah, that just seems dishonest, but let's be honest, that's what Scotty did in Next Generation. So how bad is it really? He's one of our heroes, right? Nobody knows what I'm talking about. Oh my goodness, I really am old. All right, we got one more. Megan, did your group identify the last one? Okay, and so what are those?
It includes like non-conforming good and services schemes, change orders, and costs.
Yeah, so once we've actually been awarded the bid and got the contract, then we basically adjust the terms and order things that are not necessary, can inflate costs, can just basically manipulate things because we've already got the contract, which that's very devious, but unfortunately it's probably one of the more common things that happens, that occurs. So yeah, good identification. All right, we're about to get to a point that's going to make me really, really angry. But the good news is I have something that's going to make us all smile after we're done, okay? We're going to have a little bit of fun with this, because I get really, really wound up when it comes to elderly fraud. This is like one of my areas of fraud that I just it pisses me off, and I don't have a problem with people hearing me reported say that. Okay, it's just, oh my gosh, Dr. Barnes used kind of a bad word. Yeah, yeah, it really does tick me off. So what is it about the elderly that make them prime target for fraudsters? So where am I at, Matt? What to you?
Yeah, so it's a combination of things. They grew up in a generation where there's more trust between people. So,
Mhm.
right off the bat, they're generally more trusting, and the world kind of left them behind, so they might not be as up to date on everything's working. Apple might genuinely, or somebody might genuinely need legitimate payment in gift cards from
Mhm. Yeah, there's so many factors that look well into it. I think that particularly this generation of elderly, like Matt said, they tend to be more trusting. They operate in a scenario or in a idealized society where people are not trying to rip them off. Let's be honest. While there was still fraud occurring 50 years ago, it was not as operationalized as it exists nowadays. And so they just have a general trust of more people. Also, when we talk about elderly, is it possible that elderly could not be in their positive mental faculties? They could have problems in that regard. Yeah. So they have mental fatigue. I also wrote down loneliness. I mean, I'm sure you probably have older people that you associate with, maybe grandparents, and probably when you come visit them, that's a highlight of their time because they don't really get to do anything else. And imagine people who are just kind of very disassociated with their children and their grandchildren and just kind of like, I just want somebody to talk to. Somebody gives them a call, and telemarketer is like, this is the best part of my day. which is sad. It's sad that we come to that, but it's simple truth is that that's something. Probably something that's really important to note is that if you're elderly, you're probably not working means you probably have established distributable wealth. All right. Now it's not always true. I will say one thing that's really, really sad. There was a former graduate student who he worked part-time over at Hy-Vee. And he actually encountered somebody else that I knew, and they were talking, having a conversation. And said, "So when do you plan to retire?" And he's my age. This guy that he was talking to is my age. Says, "Oh, I'm never going to retire." Which that's unfortunately the worry that I have for people when they become elderly my age. By the way, I've got a good plan of retirement, so you don't have to worry about me. I'm just going to be sitting around lonely waiting on the phone. Okay. I mean, maybe kind of like dialing you guys, say, "Hey, what you up to?" I said, "Dr. Barnes, I'm working right now. Go away." You know, but all right. But that is a concern when we talk about established lines of wealth. That may not be true for the elderly, which is probably more concerning in the grand scheme of things. But if we have distributable wealth and channels, and I'm not saying they have immense wealth, immense extra assets, I'm saying that they have channels to their wealth. That they have enough that they can survive if nobody's trying to rip them off. But then you get these people who are just kind of like, well, these people have money, I'm going to take that money. And some people do not need too much rationalization to do that. Some people say if it's a resource and I can have it, I'm going to take it. Remember, I talked to you a little bit about some old fraudsters who are become advisors now, but they freely admit said, "I enjoyed fraud. I enjoyed ripping people off." Sam Antar was an example of that. Said, "If you allowed me to become a con, I would become a con again. I would steal from you." He said that openly to our faces. Said if he would do that, if he could get away with it, if it wasn't being monitored. So that's really, really concerning. That's really, really problematic. Combination of all those factors can make them prey for fraudsters. Now, that being said, okay, I'm thoroughly pissed off right now, okay? But that being said, I did encounter this on YouTube, which brought a big smile to my face. And I can't record this because it's a proprietary video. So I'm going to share it with you all. You can find the link on YouTube. I'll show you basically I'll show the beginning of it, and then I'm going to cut off the recording so that I don't have YouTube saying that I'm violating copy content.
If you want all your like savings are gone, but I can help you.
Was just a link to a spin.
That would be awful if that was a link to a scam right there. Yeah. Oh man, that would make me so sad. Yeah. So that bring a smile to my face. Now, again, there are some factors that we could actually take about here. Like I don't know how actual effective this is. It did bring a smile to my face. Ultimately, I would like to just have a lot more protocols and a lot more protection in place for the elderly, because I think that's ultimately what we're going to do. I actually had a capstone topic because we used to share capstone topics with the students instead of them being self-developed. And one of mine was basically accountant's responsibility for protecting clients who are elderly. I think that's something that would be very, very important in that regard, because we know that they're very heavy prey to this particular type of area. So yeah, something to concern ourselves with. We talk about how to ruin a scammer's day. That would be something that would make me a little bit happy. So, all right, last question. What are some indicators that your computer has been compromised by a virus? Okay, so let's see. I'm sorry, Tyler. What'd you identify? What'd your group identify?
Says so unexpected hot bugs, the random files in their battery free, so
Yeah, so your computer slows down, you get pop-up windows that intersect. Even if you got an antivirus software, that can happen, because viruses can actually go to your registry and actually perform operations outside of normal operations or parameters. Yeah. So certainly anything when your computer operates in a way that you did not expect it to operate when that happens. Ultimately, I think the easiest way to determine if your computer has been hit by a virus is when something like this happens.
All right, Edgar. Now drop a train on him. Ah! That is not a small number. That is a big number. What am I gonna do? Computer over? Virus equals very yes. That's not a good prize. Oh.
What's that? It is Homestar Runner. Yeah. So yeah. Yep. So yeah, if that happens to your computer, then you're probably in bad shape, guys. You're probably in a rough shape. Yeah. So keep in mind. All right. We're gonna pause here. We got a quiz we're gonna take. So all right, we're on to presentations. Group 1, you're up. Which this is not group 1, I realize, but still.
You had a different one pull up, and I was like, there should be one, there's.
Trying to keep going to those AJ.
Okay, so we were working with the workers' compensation fraud. And some of the key parties were, doctors, various lawyers, marketers, like the health industry employees, and then the victims were, migrant seasonal workers.
And then there were also the two main perpetrators of this crime, and it was Carlos Arguello and Fermin Iglesias. And those aren't actual pictures of them, they're actually like singers that have the same names. But these two perpetrators set up various patient recruiting and scheduling companies in Mexico and Central America and basically directed the patients to various providers.
Okay, so the two main parties, Iglesias and Arguello, they would basically have like advertisements set up on billboards, and it was like, if you're injured, call this number and we'll get you help. So then they would refer those people that were injured to like a specific set of doctors and lawyers that they were all in a ring together, and they would overcharge them. So for like an ice pack, they charged them like $900. Just like ridiculous costs or something like that that they didn't need. And then they would get like the insurance claims from that, and then they would split the money. So yeah.
And just the aftermath, our two main perpetrators had 5 and 4 years. And like other parties, like our lawyers and our professionals, they had anywhere up to 10 years. And then because it was like healthcare and insurance that was like being charged, there was 1.2 billion in suspected billings that had been frozen. And then California passed a law that like froze any suspensions for medical bills, like for anyone who was related to the fraud.
Yeah.
So we know how they stole the money, but why? Well, it's very easy. They just wanted to make an obscene amount of money from people who didn't know any better. That's as near as we can tell, that's why they did it, just because they could, really.
And then looking at the opportunities of how they were able to do it, they were operating in Mexico and Central America, so there's very little US oversight in those countries. And then also they were working with migrant workers, so those are minorities that may not know English as well, may not know that they're actually getting scammed.
So their rationalization was that although they were scamming the companies paying for these healthcare, the patients were actually still getting the care they needed. Although you could argue that it was mentioned that sometimes they were getting procedures done, and maybe they might not have needed a procedure necessarily at the time that they were asking for help. So you could argue that maybe unnecessary procedures kind of were hurting them, but overall the patients were still getting the help they needed.
And then lessons learned, first, collusion is a pain in the butt to deal with. We can see that many people were all working together, whether it be the lawyers, the doctors, the marketers, just the people making billboards up there and routing calls. So it's just hard to stop that and prevent it if it is happening. You should also be cautious when the same company is representing many claims. So California kind of took a step into this where they froze all claims by those companies. But I think they should also go a step further and be like, hey, this company is doing 85% of the claims in a month. Maybe look into that before just continuing to allow that. And then also educating workers and maybe put a system in place at the job level for workers' compensation claims instead of just the individual has to find a lawyer and that's how they do it. So maybe just educating your workers a little better.
Pretty good. Alright, so we did ours, well, we didn't do ours. Our case was on the telemarketing fraud. And the summary is it happened in 2012, 2019. So the scammers would use a money sucking website to see like who the most vulnerable victims would be. I didn't know that was a thing. And then they post as telemarketing marketers and they will promise fake business and investment opportunities and also services such as like doing their tax preparations for helping design websites. And they found out the most vulnerable victims were the elderly, Dr. Bonner's favorite victims, you know, and
Hey now.
okay, just kidding. And then they will offer like coaching services and tax services, but they never gave it to them, so it's like never legitimate. And lastly, once they were out of services to offer, they would offer them debt release services, basically just suck them dry, all their money.
So the key parties and people involved, it was mainly a group of 10 people. And here they're all listed. I found it interesting that they were spread out in America, all in different locations, working together, and all different ages also. And all these people were charged with one count to commit wire fraud with connection and telemarketing. And they all were said to recruit 10 or more people over 55 years old, which gave them a max 30 years sentence or up to a max 30 years sentence. But I thought this was kind of interesting, like if they recruited less people or younger people, then that would change the sentence. And then going on to these two people, Derek Larkin and Maddie Raylo.
Yeah.
They were both involved in many operations for this scheme, and coming to the end of it in 2019, law enforcement went to search one of their offices. And these two people got caught trying to delete a lot of information from the data and the computers that they were about to take. So they both got charged with obstruction of justice, which is additional max 20 years.
So there's two parts to the overall, telemarketing scheme. The first was what they were calling the business opportunity scheme. And so the goal for these marketers was to get these, like a lot of elderly individuals to invest to create the small online business. And then they would also try to get them to buy these like services, to make that business more profitable. And the telemarketing sales floors were all pretty much interconnected. So the information that one sales floor would get, they would transfer it and give it to the other sales floors. And then Tyler talked about the money sucking website. So a lot of the names of vulnerable individuals were posted on there. So so the names kind of were like given around to all the different sales floors. Something else that that they were trying to do was they would tell some of the individuals that they qualified for government grants for starting a small business, and then that they should also purchase these business services so that they can make money before the grant came in. But there really wasn't any grant, and then also these services, they weren't really getting the services of what the investment that they had, so.
So like we said, the last one was a lot of false promises and services that they said they would provide, which they never did. The debt release scheme came after. Basically, they would suck them dry of all their money and then forcing many of the people to go into debt or max out their credit cards. And when they did, they would then offer them the debt release scheme. This was basically them saying, oh, we'll consolidate your debt or help you alleviate the debt, which they never did that either. And they would suck even more money out of them. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Right.
That's awkward.
Well, Okay, don't look at that.
Just do like this.
Yeah, yeah, let's just leave it like that. We had also the telemarketing scheme, but just going into more of the repercussions and whatnot.
I'll start with the opportunity, lack of financial security. They did not understand exactly where their money was going most of the time, so they didn't really know exactly what to do with it. They tend to have savings or extra sources of money that they can give out. They don't really know exactly what to do. And it's easier to trick, they're over trusting, like Matt said earlier.
Some rationalization we saw from the fraudsters were they really don't need the money in the future. It's a pretty gloomy way to look at that. And they're willingly giving us their money for these fraudulent investments. And then there wasn't really a whole lot of information on pressures, so we kind of had to guess. I have my theories of gambling debt. I feel like typically you see that on a lot of fraudsters' backgrounds, and then just regular gluttony and laziness on trying to make a quick buck from the elderly.
So as far as lessons learned, I think overall it just goes to show that like there needs to be better protections for the elderly. And I think there already are some in place. Like obviously if you commit elder fraud, you're more liable to, I think, more years in prison and whatnot. But I think there needs to be better education. Maybe for the elderly that do have a bunch of like computers and stuff, they should get some anti-scam software. Maybe like if your grandma wants to invest in something, there should be someone that they trust to like co-sign for them. And then overall, just like there needs to be more investigations. In general, I feel like in our society, I think the fact that so many people are willing to target like elders kind of just goes to show that we're not all the most ethical people. So maybe we should just like enforce ethics in schools a little more than we already do. And then I think most importantly, it's just like, if you have any elderly people in your life, like your own family or just people you know, are susceptible to this, then you should just make sure they're aware of the risks. Yeah. So we had the defense contractor fraud. Okay, so I couldn't find actual pictures of the people, but I figured this was good enough. And so we have three main parties, and I'm gonna warn you guys now, I don't know how to pronounce these names. Yuxel Symbol, 36, the girl right here. And this whole paragraph is literally just all the counts that she had, of like what she was charged with. And so, I mean, like conspiracy or your conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy, 8 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, like everything. I'm not even gonna go through that. But so I found on a different site that was 275,000 430 was like how much she had to pay, I believe, after everything happened. And then the two fellows here are the co-conspirators, Mehmet Askan and Unar Simske. So they were manufacturing the parts in Turkey. And then top guy here, he was already had been debarred from contracting with the US government because of a similar fraud that happened. So he wasn't the main person in this operation because of that reason. Currently fugitives, so watch out for them.
So basically, the way the fraud worked is, Assemble created a front company called Mason Engineering Parts LLC. And they pretended that this company was a vetted and qualified manufacturer of military components. And then they used this company to win contracts to supply the military with components, some of which were critical components for aircraft carriers, submarines, armored vehicles, tanks, and other weapon systems. And they used, they remote controlled computers in order to illegally move, like drawings and blueprints of military technology to Turkey.
So then the co-conspirators would send the parts to Symbol, and then the Symbol would like just make sure to leave or get rid of any trace that they came from Turkey, and then claim to the US government that they came from the US. And then after like they got the money, they were sent it back to Turkey. And then just none of the parts were probably like what the government was expecting. So then, yeah, hold on. So this lady is the attorney general or something? Deputy attorney general who was there at the time when the fraud was caught. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
No, go away. How do I get it to go? Okay, no, no. Okay, where's ours?
Five of them, let's see what's there, check the second one. It's that one, okay.
Oh.
Oh, here it is. Let me open my email, see if I can pin the vendors. I'm pretty sure it's sent to them.
So it was not sent. 1 second.
All right, so that would be why it's not up there yet.
Here, let me grab my computer. I actually do have HDMI. Do you want me to just plug it in?
Sure.
Where's the system?
I don't really know how to do this. That makes two of us.
Well, then we will try this out.
Score together.
Oh, did you send it to?
Okay, it's right
never
here.
mind,
It's
never
right here. We're good.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's happens. All right, we're good.
Hmm. So we had a fraud triangle analysis and like summary of the case of all the people whose names I can't pronounce as well. So first thing, opportunity. They had the ability to make money quickly from huge government contracts. No one was looking into where they got their parts, and there was no strong background checks or vetting process.
So some pressure, not really sure, it wasn't stated, but you'd have to assume if you're gonna take out to defraud the government and the military of the United States, probably some financial pressures or just bad morals that you thought that was a good idea. Okay, so then the rationalization, they were still making the parts that needed to be made. And so, maybe it's okay, they're just making them in Turkey. And they're not selling the information on the black market that we know. They just used it to make the parts cheaper in Turkey probably, so they can make more money. So,
So then some solutions and some lessons to be learned. First of all is to make sure you're vetting your part suppliers. make sure they are who they say they are, and it's not people who shouldn't be making those parts, have an in-person inspection in the production facility, make sure that they're actually making the parts and not just repackaging parts. And then, slapping a label on and saying they're good. Testing products to confirm that they meet specifications. It was brought up that a lot of these critical use parts were having issues and were breaking. So that definitely quality control needs to be involved there, making sure that there's no issues. And then better controls surrounding critical parts schematics, the blueprints that are used to make the parts. Yep, that's it.
I feel like you mentioned the submarines was one of those things that kind of triggered me. It's like, if I'm on a submarine, I'm not sure that I want to be, to know that many of the parts on the submarine are provided by the lowest cost provider.
That's all military grade stuff.
That's all military grade, yeah. So real quick question for you, it's just a hypothetical. This is going to lead into what we're going to be talking about the next couple of weeks. So one of the group that provided the information on the elder fraud case had noted that the for perpetrators of the case, they had 30-year max sentences as well as some 20-year sentences for additional frauds with trying to what was the term that was like obstruction of justice? Yeah, okay. Do we think that people would rationally commit a fraud if they thought they were going to have to face 30-year sentences or 20-year sentences? So that should basically say that if we don't believe that, like if you thought you were going to go to prison for 30 years by committing a fraud, you wouldn't commit that fraud, right? So that should be an effective deterrent. The question is, why is it not an effective deterrent? Yeah, people are not nationally rational. That's a good possibility. Yeah. So, but the kind of the problem is that people do not think that they're going to get caught when they commit a crime. I want you to keep that in mind as we start talking about fraud prevention and deterrence the next couple of weeks. Probably one of the issues that we're going to run into is that deterrence is not necessarily a good prevention mechanism because people do not necessarily rationalize or conceptualize those deterrent schemes. We know that currently the penalties for committing certain types of fraud are massive, and yet people still do it. And so there's going to be some interesting questions about, do we need to rethink about how we approach penalty assessment and maybe do something more on the front end as opposed to thinking about how we punish people on the back end. All right, auditors, see you tomorrow. Everyone else, have a good weekend.